Welcome to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies.
Holy Scripture and the Trance State. Part 1. The Old Testament. Donald J. Bretherton. The Reverend Donald Bretherton lived in Canterbury after his retirement, and was a frequent contributor to the Christian Parapsychologist journal. This article was in the September 1990 edition of the Christian Parapsychologist, and may reflect the language and attitudes of the time in which it was written. Responsibility for opinions expressed herein rests solely with the author, and such opinions must not be taken to represent those of the CFPSS. In traditional church circles, there are certain loaded words which are regarded with suspicion and a certain amount of antagonism. Such terms as witch, familiar, spiritualist, medium, trance, and so on are heavily weighted by prejudice and misunderstanding, and conjure up in some minds ideas of black magic, sorcery, devil worship and communication with demons and evil spirits. This is not surprising when we take into account deep-rooted attitudes based on the apparent biblical condemnation of mediums. Modern translations of the relevant passages of Scripture have given added support to views which, several hundred years ago, led to the persecution, torture, and murder of many innocent people, mainly women, accused of witchcraft and trafficking with the devil. Contemporary translators have unfortunately, and mistakenly, inserted the word medium, where the original passages actually refer to necromantic practices involving the resuscitation of dead bodies. In no sense can such abhorrent activities be equated with most present-day mediumship as practiced in recognized spiritualistic circles. I have discussed the biblical prohibitions, and the Hebrew originals, in some detail elsewhere, and there is neither space nor opportunity to repeat the argument here. However, there is another term which I have not dealt with hitherto which, I believe, needs further elucidation. It is the word trance. The use of this word should not cause any real consternation because it is a scriptural word and it has an important place in biblical usage. Trance revelation. The Hebrew form is tardima and it is first used in Genesis chapter 2.21 to describe the deep sleep or trance state which fell upon Adam when God removed a rib to form woman. This Hebrew term is used several times to describe a divinely induced condition in order to carry out some supernatural purpose or to reveal hidden truth. Gerhard von Rad says that in the forming of Eve out of Adam, a deep sleep falls upon man, a kind of magical sleep that completely extinguishes his consciousness, whilst R. Davison comments, the man is in a trance or deep sleep, a word used elsewhere in the Old Testament to describe a condition in which man receives a vision or message which comes from God unasked. Quite properly, then, the New English Bible translators render the passage, and so the Lord God put the man in a trance, and while he slept, he took one of the ribs and closed the flesh over the place. It is also significant that in translating the Hebrew into the Greek of the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, those engaged on the task used the Greek word ecstasis, from which we get our word ecstasy. Ecstasis is made up of two Greek forms, ek, meaning out of, and stasis, a standing, and together they mean a standing out of, or displacement, hence, the throwing of the mind out of its normal state, a trance. It is defined by Liddell and Scott thus, a being put out of its place, of the mind, distraction, astonishment, a trance. It is used, as we will see shortly, 3 times in the Acts of the Apostles, and F. Bruce calls it there, literally, a state of mind in which a man stands outside himself, a trance. The Oxford New English Dictionary states, the classical senses of ecstasis are insanity, or bewilderment, but in later Greek etymological meaning received another application, viz. Withdrawal of the soul from the body, mystic and prophetic trance, hence in later medical writers the word is used for a trance etc. in general. The Oxford Classical Dictionary defines ecstasis as follows. In Classical and Hellenistic Greek it means a pathological condition, madness or unconsciousness, or, colloquially, the state of being beside oneself with anger. Later it signifies a trance state, in which the soul, quitting the body, sees visions as in Acts 10:10. Ecstasis is also used in the Septuagint of Genesis chapter 15:12 to translate the Hebrew tardima where, we are told, a trance came over Abraham, New English Bible, a kind of anesthetic sleep, a divinely conditioned trance state. H. Hook says of this event, after performing the ancient ritual of the dividing of slain victims, Abraham in a trance sees Yahweh pass between the divided corpses of the victims in the form of a smoking furnace and a flaming torch. This actually represented a crucial moment in the life of Abraham and in the history of the Jewish people because this was the occasion when God made a solemn covenant with him and his descendants in recognition of the faith of Abraham. Not only does it represent an historical and religious turning point, but it also became the source of inspiration both to Hebrew scholars and New Testament writers to whom Abraham was the supreme example of faith and righteousness. The fact that this great promise should be given when Abraham was in a trance is an indication that biblical authorities had no hesitation in accepting that Yahweh sometimes used this method at crucial moments to communicate with his servants. The same Hebrew term is used in 1 Samuel chapter 26:12 where King Saul is described as being delivered into the hands of David because a deep sleep from the Lord was fallen upon them. It is used here to indicate an unnatural sleep, as in Isaiah chapter 19:10, where God is described as sending a supernatural slumber upon the people. In Job 4:13 the same word appears in a vivid description by Eliphaz, one of Job's so-called comforters, whilst in a trance, experiencing an alarming visitation. It is one of the most uncanny passages in the Old Testament with its account of the gradual building up before him of a strange apparition, a clammy something which made his bones shake and his knees tremble. I have dealt in detail with the significance for biblical parapsychology of this visitation in the CFPSS Quarterly Review, summer 1985. Now a message was brought to me secretly, my ear received a whisper of it. Amid strange thoughts, in a night vision, when a trance condition falls upon men, a fit of trembling came upon me, and shuddering, and all my bones shook. A spirit glided past my face, the hair of my flesh stood on end. It paused, but I could not discern its shape, just a dull form before my eyes. Silence, then I heard a voice. 2. The opened eyes and hearing ears. Job 4:1-2-1-6. The belief that God spoke to men in the depth of the night when something deeper than normal sleep came upon him is reiterated in Job 33:15, for Elihu, another comforter, asserts that God speaks to men in many ways, as in dreams and visions of the night by which he instructs men. In dreams and visions of the night, when a trance sleep, tardima, falls upon men, while they sleep in their beds, God makes them listen. The words, makes them listen, translate literally as, uncovers, a term generally used of, uncovering the ear, supernaturally so that the recipient may hear clairaudiently the things hidden from normal sensitivity. It is a form constantly used in the Old Testament of God speaking mysteriously to his chosen followers in order to give them guidance and instruction. The Hebrew forms, tardima, and the Greek equivalent, ecstasis, are not always used to express the trance experience as such. This condition is sometimes described in other terms, or is implied by the very context in which it is placed. For instance, a strange and highly amusing story is set amidst the rules and ordinances of the Book of Numbers. It relates how Balak the king of Moab, fearful of the growing power and menacing progress of the Israelites, sent for Balaam, a heathen soothsayer, to curse them and thus bring about their downfall. Balaam must have had a formidable reputation as a sorcerer according to the royal invitation, I know that those whom you bless are blessed, and those whom you curse are cursed. Numbers 22-6, Neb. Things, however, went wrong this time. On every occasion on which Balaam tried to curse the chosen people, he was unable to do so, and instead found himself bestowing a blessing upon them. In a final attempt, he was strangely compelled not only to bless them but also to foretell the future glory and triumph of Israel. He described his experience as follows: when the Spirit of God came upon him, the very word of Balaam son of Beor, the oracle of one whose eye sees clearly, the oracle of one who hears the words of God, who sees a vision from the Almighty, who falls into a trance, and whose eyes are uncovered. Numbers chapter 24 verses 3-5, see also 15-16. The passage describes Balaam as falling prostrate, in a trance with the eyes of the flesh closed, but with the inward eye open to the vision of the Almighty. Or, as emphasized by a marginal note in the AV, Hebrew, who had his eyes shut, but now opened. In abandoning the artificial divinatory and magical methods, Numbers chapter 24 verse 1, his inner vision was mysteriously and divinely opened when he fell into a trance and he was able to see what was revealed to him. Several Hebrew terms are used both of uncovering the ears so as to hear that which is concealed from normal hearing, and uncovering the eyes in order to see that which is hidden from normal sight. For instance, the word galar, to strip, to uncover, when used with ozen, ear, means to make known, reveal, but literally, to uncover the ear, that is, to lay it open for whispering something into it, and, when God is the subject, to suggest a special revelation. In the words of S.R. Driver, the expression is used of any sudden or miraculous enlightenment. Similarly, when linked with iron, eye, to give sight, cause to see, a divine initiative is implied whereby the eyes are opened up, and a mystical enlarging of the psychical and spiritual faculties is indicated, as the context generally shows. So when the path of Balaam was obstructed by an angel with a drawn sword, only his steed saw it and drew aside, crushing Balaam's foot. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, uncovered Balaam's eyes, Hebrew. He saw the angel of the Lord, Numbers chapter 22 verse 31. This supernatural form of disclosure in which the recipient is enabled to see the invisible and to hear the whispering words of Yahweh finds parallels elsewhere in the Old Testament. When Samuel was told by the Lord that he was sending to him the man he had chosen to be anointed king, the text reads, "Now the Lord had told Samuel in his ear a day before Saul came," that is, literally, the Lord had uncovered the ear of Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 9 verse 15, AV. Hans Hertzberg says of this incident, Samuel received a revelation perceptible to the ear, as the literal rendering of the Hebrew shows. When God promised to bless the house of David, whether it was his dynasty or the temple later built by Solomon is not entirely clear. David graciously and prayerfully acknowledged this divine disclosure to him. For thou, O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, hast revealed, opened the ear, to thy servant, saying, I will build thee an house. 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 27. Similarly, when the king of Syria surrounded the city of Dothan with a mighty host, Elisha prayed that the eyes of his servant, who was in a great panic, should be opened. And Elisha prayed, and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and, behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. 2 Kings chapter 6 verse 17. John Skinner has referred to this as the greater host, invisible to mortal eyes, horses and chariots of fire, that protected Elisha. However we may interpret this incident, it is told as part of the series of miraculous events associated with Elisha and the mysterious powers which both surrounded him and enabled him. The narrative goes on to describe how, as a result of the prayer of Elisha, the Syrian forces were smitten with blindness and were led stumbling into the midst of Samaria. He then prayed that their eyes should be opened, and they saw. This would not seem to be, as it were, a restoration of normal sight, but the removal of unearthly blinkers which had caused them to be confused and bewildered. What seems to have been sent upon the men was an illusion which prevented them from seeing what was before them. See also Genesis chapter 19 verse 11. Thus, seeing, and not seeing, belongs here to the realm of the paranormal rather than to that of the normal. This is particularly true of prophetic revelation, for God not only opens up their inner eyes and ears, but also, at times, heals their dumbness and enables them to speak by putting His word into their mouths. He opens the mouth of Ezekiel, touches the mouth of Jeremiah, and both touches the lips and opens the mouth of Daniel. So also, one of the visions of Amos is introduced with the words, "I saw," the rest by the phrase, "Yahweh made me see." It appears that in this case the prophet is reporting an experience which is now past. Just as in one case an abnormal power of sight has been developed in the prophet, so in the other case he has obtained abnormal powers of hearing, writes T.H. Robinson. In a remarkable passage in Isaiah chapter 29 verse 10, the opposite effect is described by the prophet who tells how God will deal with the apostates and idolaters of Jerusalem by blinding the eyes of the prophets and visionaries and stopping their ears, i.e., uncovering their heads, for the Lord has poured upon you a spirit of trance, tardima, He has sealed your eyes, the prophets, He has covered your heads, the seers. Balaam is often quoted as an example of the non-Israelite, half-pagan seer. He is the man who had his eyes shut but now opened, that is, the man with the seeing eye. Yet he is also depicted as delivering his oracles in a trance state, and therefore has been classed as a genuine ecstatic as well as a clairvoyant. J. Lindblom says, Balaam shows traits both of seer in the strict sense of a prophet, but such a combination of seer and prophet is very common in the religious world. He further comments, it is not easy to draw a definite dividing line between the seer and the prophet, either in the pagan world or in ancient Israel. There are scholars who even maintain that there did not exist any difference at all between seers and prophets in Israel. The relationship between seership and prophecy is a vast and debatable theme and too complicated to be discussed here in detail, but we can safely say that both classes, whether ecstatic seers or radical prophets, were visionaries. Some were quite clearly ecstatic visionaries. 3. Seership and prophecy. The prophecy of Ezekiel begins with the dramatic words, "The heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God." John Weaver says that visions of God is a technical term for an ecstatic vision in which the prophet sees the deity, and the hand of the Lord is a phrase referring to the ecstatic state. Such comments as, "The Spirit entered into me," "The Spirit lifted me up," and so on, have similar implications. John B. Taylor interprets the visionary experiences of Ezekiel in the first 3 chapters of his prophecy as follows. All this took place while Ezekiel was in his state of trance. Furthermore, in a most extraordinary sequence of mystical experiences, Ezekiel describes how he was transported to Jerusalem to see the blasphemies committed in the city and in the temple, after being caught up in his state of trance, Ezekiel chapter 8 verse 2 and following. Ezekiel says that the Lord put forth the form of a hand and took him by the lock of his head, which John Weavers amusingly calls the first instance of ecstatic transport by hair. Harold Knight, however, theorizes that as the soul is an elastic complex of forces which can extend its power through space as well as time, so the prophet, energized by the Spirit, can project his soul through space. Not that it leaves the body, but rather, the heightened spiritual consciousness of the prophet, whether concentrated in the eye or ear, bursts the bounds of time or space which would normally limit its action. So, Ezekiel in Babylon can see the wickedness perpetrated in the temple at Jerusalem. This is because the starting point for Ezekiel's visions in ecstatic trance is his intense mental preoccupation with the blasphemous wickedness of the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Prior to his exile, he has seen with bodily eyes the heathen idolatries which now desecrate God's sanctuary. An exile in Babylon, his heart is in Jerusalem and his attention is rapt in contemplation of its evil, and of the fierce wrath of God, at last about to burst forth upon and consume a faithless people. Such an intense concentration of attention is sufficient to excite the trance state, and there surges up before him in visual, objective form, as though from some source outside himself, those vivid images which memory supplies and which now stand out with such luminous clarity that he believes himself to be living and moving at the very spot to which his vision relates. On the other hand, however, there are indications that in this particular case, Ezekiel experienced a form of projection in which he found himself in Jerusalem viewing for himself the vile events taking place. Professor Wheeler Robinson points out that psychical phenomena are described that bear resemblance, at least, to catalepsy. He remains dumb after his call, he is to lie in one position for a lengthy period. He is conscious of being transported from Babylon to Jerusalem, that he might describe to the elders what he had seen in the temple apparently during a trance state. The vividness of the description and the intensity of the narrative suggest some kind of actual eyewitness. Such states also frequently involved a vision of the glory of the Lord, combined with overwhelming light and splendor. John Weavers says, in Ezekiel the glory is always seen in ecstatic vision and not by ordinary vision, and adds, as in Isaiah, the vision issues in the prophet's falling on his face, that is, in the position of worship and obeisance. However, something else may be implied when we are told that the prophet fell prostrate on his face, indicating that he had fallen into a trance. For instance, Ezekiel says, "The hand of the Lord came upon me there. The glory of the Lord was there, and I fell down on my face." 3:22-24, also in 1:28-2:1, like the appearance of the glory of the Lord. "When I saw this, I fell on my face, and heard a voice." Also in 43:2-3, "And I beheld the glory of the God of Israel, and I fell on my face." In like terms, Daniel is described as falling on his face in a trance accompanying a visionary experience, 8:17, 18, 10-9, 15, just as Balaam fell down, having his eyes uncovered. Harry Mobley indicates that, on several occasions, the inspiration of the prophet is said to be due to the hand of Yahweh upon him. This has often been misunderstood to denote the onset of ecstasy. We know that the term ecstasy is still widely used of this condition, and David Peterson defines it more closely: ecstasy, or, more precisely termed, trance or possession behavior. Although he goes on to add that it does not appear prominently, if at all, in the behavior of Israel's prophets, he agrees that as prophecy involves so complex a role, one should expect, on purely theoretical grounds, that prophecy entails more than one level of organismic involvement. Mobley carefully particularizes the case of Ezekiel, where the hand of Yahweh occurs predominantly in surmises, since Ezekiel does manifest what looks like ecstatic behavior on a number of occasions, suggesting that hand of Yahweh refers to the onset of ecstasy seems well-founded. He warns, however, that it would be wrong to separate the use of the phrase in the prophetic context from its use elsewhere. Walter Zimmerly refers to the presence of the hand of Yahweh coming upon Ezekiel in the introduction to the accounts of the 4 great visions of the book, and also in 3:14 at the end of such an account. Moreover, under the hand of Yahweh which comes upon him, the prophet sees divine visions, which are recounted in what follows. Furthermore, 3:14 and following shows how the heavy weight of Yahweh's hand on the prophet on one occasion puts him for a whole week in a state of speechless rigidity. Thus the glory of the Lord, the hand of the Lord, the visions, the word of the Lord, especially in Jeremiah, the activity of the spirit, breath or wind, are all terms involved in expressing the supernatural activity of God in invoking the trance state. This sometimes included the prophet falling down on his face during this condition whilst he was unable to see, hear, and receive the divine message. John Skinner notes that the call of Isaiah dates from the moment when in an ecstasy, he saw the Lord. The vision is undoubtedly an actual experience, not merely the embodiment of an idea, for then Isaiah saw God, not indeed with his bodily eyes, but in a prophetic trance, in which the ordinary operations of the mind were suspended and spiritual realities assumed concrete and visible forms. Similarly, Edward J. Young describes the experience of Isaiah, implying the trance state, but avoiding the use of the word trance. Isaiah saw the Lord, but in a vision. In mysterious manner the power of God came over the prophet, so that he became unconscious to the outside world, and yet with the inner eye saw what God had revealed to him. It was thus a divinely imposed vision, one that was objective to Isaiah in that it was not the product of Isaiah's mind. Indeed, many exegetes in fact put forward the suggestion that he may have been carried into the temple in his vision like Ezekiel. The prophecy of Amos begins with the ascription, the words of Amos which he saw. The work includes 5 visions in which he both saw and beard, and he is called a seer by the priest Amaziah, Amos chapter 7 verse 12, which Henry McKeating says is not intended to be used in a derogatory sense but is just a synonym for prophet, and Amos takes it so in his reply. Other prophets also describe seeing the word of the Lord. Whether it was a word which the prophet saw, or a voice which he heard, in Hebrew the visionary and auditory terms, says G. Ernest Wright, have simply become a technical language for direct revelation. Even when vision is used, the content is nearly always a word spoken or heard. Such terms as ecstasy, prophetic ecstasy, dream vision, seeing with the inner eye, and so on, are used at times to disguise the perhaps rather unwelcome fact, as far as biblical scholars are concerned, that many prophetic visions were received when the prophet was in a trance condition. However, even the word ecstasy carried with it rather unpleasant associations because some earlier recorded actions of seers and prophets included descriptions of their violent and unrestrained conduct whilst in this condition. Such actions tended to be associated with traditional manifestations of ecstatic possession. Whilst such exhibitionism characterized a number of earlier prophetic schools, it did not become the norm and was hardly representative of most of the prophetic experiences we have considered in this paper. In this connection, Harold Knight warns, "It is surely a mistake to seek to eliminate the visionary element from the consciousness of the great prophets themselves. I saw the Lord is a phrase which is used not only by Micah, but also by Amos and Isaiah, and which denotes some kind of supernormal ecstatic experience, Amos chapter 9 verse 1, Isaiah chapter 6 verse 1. Once the prophet has received the call to prophesy, there breaks forth upon his consciousness the vision of an unseen and glorious world interpenetrating and transfiguring the prosaic world of every day. He is equipped with psychical gifts befitting his office. Isaiah, wrapped in ecstatic meditation in the sanctuary at Jerusalem, is crushed by the dreadful majesty of the Ancient of Days. Ezekiel feels that the heavens are opened. Clearly, seer and prophet were closely related. Both classes were men of peculiar and abnormal powers of behavior. The seer, as his name implies, was a man gifted with the power of second sight, able to enter a world different from that which ordinary men inhabit, and to become conscious of sights and sounds which were beyond the range of others. Both were believed to owe their peculiar powers, actions and experiences to direct contact with God. T.H. Robinson, goes on to add, "It is generally admitted that ecstatic experiences and conduct played some part in the life of all who bore the name of prophet, and that at least the initial call to their ministry came this way." 4. The suffering servants of the Lord. The prophets who fell into an ecstatic state were not men of unbalanced mind, but, stresses H. Wheeler Robinson, 49, certain features of prophetic writings do seem to point to an identity of psychical experience. Indeed, as J.G.S. Thompson indicates, the borderline between vision and dream or trance is difficult if not impossible to determine, and this is reflected in the biblical vocabulary of vision. Clearly, then, even references to prophetic ecstasy, or an ecstatic condition, do not necessarily mean that the prophet has become possessed by some violent and unpredictable force, but rather that he had entered into a condition whereby he was enabled to become receptive of hidden truths and realities and to communicate them to others. Not all prophets, then, were by any means ecstatic, in the sense of violent actions or inane conduct. Further, the experiences related by the classical prophets in no way imply personal exhibitionism, but rather emphasize the glory, justice, and righteousness of God and the gravity of the message bestowed. They point from themselves to God, and from God to the people. Such oracles were even at times received during a waking trance in a public place. As R.C. Johnson 51 has said, there are other states in which consciousness is withdrawn from the normal waking level, which collectively we may call trance states. A medium or sensitive can pass voluntarily to an interior level of the self, and can at the same time maintain a communication line by writing and speaking to those around. It is therefore possible to exteriorize knowledge possessed by levels of his own deeper self. This sensitivity could at times extend to physical awareness so vivid as to include the sensations of touch and even pain. Bearing this in mind, Jeremiah must also be classed amongst the visionary prophets, for it can clearly be established that the preaching of Jeremiah certainly did not lack a visionary element, declares Walter Zimmerli. This emphasis may have shifted later to the transmission of preaching, but when his lips were touched, 1-9, and he was told by God, "Behold, I have put my words in your mouth," this was more than an impression of feeling, for Jeremiah is aware of the way in which his lips have actually been touched. We have referred to the phrase, "the hand of the Lord," as indicating entrance into the trance state, and it would appear that the same condition is implied here. It is so vivid and real that he feels the touch of the Almighty. Nor is this all, for the fire that is kindled through the prophet against the people, the touching of his mouth by Yahweh at the time of the commissioning with the prophetic message, imply an experience that seized the prophet totally in all his different senses, continues Walter Zimmerli, and the coming of God's word completely shatters him and its effects go far beyond auditory experience. Again, in his vision of violence and destruction overtaking Jerusalem, he not only sees but also hears the shattering clash of arms to such an extent that he suffers physically, feeling the impact of horror and suffering. In the words of Zimmerli, here is not simply words that the prophet articulates, the reality of war breaks in upon all his senses. He actually hears the trumpet blast and the battle cries, his eyes actually see the war standards raised. Thus, in visions the prophet perceives the impending disaster which he must proclaim to the people. He writhes in pain on account of what he sees. The vividness of such an account in which the prophet feels himself projected into the midst of the coming disaster and judgment produces in him actual physical suffering. The terrible wrath of Yahweh, the awful burden of the message laid upon him, and the torments of the people of his beloved city combine to produce in him almost unbearable agonies. 0. The writhing of my bowels, and the throbbing of my heart. I cannot keep silence. I hear the sound of the trumpet, the sound of the battle cry. Crash upon crash, the land goes down in ruin. I hear the sound as of a woman in labor, the sharp cry of one bearing her first child. It is Zion, gasping for breath, clenching her fists. Me, I am weary, weary of slaughter. 4:19-20, 31. The compelling force of the word of the Lord laid upon him as Yahweh's agent cannot be denied, and there is no escape from it. Even if he attempts to suppress it, it flares up within him. Whenever I speak, I cry out proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long. But if I say, I will not mention him or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a burning fire, shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in, indeed, I cannot. New International Version 2.8, 9. An apparent parallel to this kind of experience is related in Isaiah chapter 21 verse 3-4, which Christopher Rowland suggests, appears to offer an account of the emotional upheaval caused by the vision. The complete subjection of the prophet to the force of his experience, verse 1, and the physical effects of it. Grim is the vision shown to me, the traitor betrayed, the spoiler himself despoiled. At this my limbs writhe in anguish, I am gripped by pangs like a woman in labor. I am distraught past hearing, dazed past seeing, my mind reels, sudden convulsions seize me. Neb. The agony of the anonymous prophet in this devastating oracle about the fall of Babylon is heightened because, in an ecstatic state, he sees the coming of the horsemen, comments G. Ernest Wright, and hears the watchman cry. Or, in the words of John Skinner, the watchman is the prophet himself in the ecstatic condition. He then sees and hears things beyond human ken. G. Ernest Wright thinks that this short prophecy was evidently presented by the school of Isaiah, and placed here among the prophecies of foreign nations. It is a condition of agitation and terror which is echoed in Nahum chapter 2 verse 10, where the prophet says of his condition, courage melting and knees giving way, writhing limbs, and faces drained of color. Neb, in fact, the prophet envisages the invasion as though it were actually taking place. Similar physical sensations, often of an almost unbearable kind, which also included feelings of extreme heat and cold, have been a feature of the experiences of mystics and saints throughout the centuries. They were particularly apparent in conditions of ecstatic trance, with the accompaniment of physical pain and even visible marks on the body. In addition, such visionaries, as the scripture indicates, were frequently misunderstood, abused, scorned, persecuted, and even put to death. Yet there have been times when they have been chosen as special vehicles of revelation, the tested channels of truth and judgment, and the media through whom God has made his will and purpose known to others.
You have been listening to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies. To find out more, please visit www.churchesfellowship.co.uk.